tonight's event is part of our Writers Writing series, and really the idea is to bring writers together and talk about their craft. Maaza Mengiste is the author of Beneath the Lion's Gaze, which was selected by The Guardian as one of 10 best contemporary African books. The novel was named one of the best books of 2010 by Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and Publishers Weekly. Her fiction and nonfiction writing can be found in The Guardian, The New York Times, BBC Radio 4, and Granta. She teaches at Queens College and at Princeton, and she has an MFA from NYU, and she's taught at NYU as well, and will do so again. Gilbert King is the author of the New York Times bestseller Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall and the Groveland Boys and the Dawn of a New America, which was awarded the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. His last book was titled The Execution of Willie Francis, Race, Murder, and the Search for Justice in the American South. He has written about the Supreme Court and the death penalty for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he's also featured as a contributor for the Smithsonian Magazine. So we're very excited to have both of you here this evening. And as I said, there won't be any formal presentations. We're just really looking forward to a rich and informal discussion about your recent works, and I have them here. For those of you who haven't read them, I thought I would give you a quick overview of each one, but not take too long with that. And then you're going to run out and buy copies this evening, I promise. So I guess I'll start with Beneath the Lion's Gaze. It's a riveting and a heartbreaking novel. It's set in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 1974. And it's as the country is on the brink of revolution. And it's really a family drama. There's the father, Halu, the mother, Salam, two sons, Jonas and Dawit. And reading it, it's really quite remarkable because you just feel like you're part of this family as you experience what they're experiencing. And they're wrestling with a changing, confusing, and very violent political climate that's emerging around them. Then alongside this family story, you also have the story of the coup in Ethiopia as witnessed through the eyes of the soon-to-be deposed emperor, Haile Selassie. Later in the book, we actually experience daily life under the Derg, and that's where this book really has a very poignant and very upsetting story to tell, but an important story to tell. Now, so that's, I'll do the visuals. Beneath the Lion's Gaze, and then Devil in the Grove by Gilbert King. This book is a detailed account of one of the most important legal cases argued by Thurgood Marshall to take down Jim Crow. In 1949, Marshall was serving as special counsel to the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP when he learned of this case. 4 African-American men, and I'm going to say their names because I think that's important, Walter Irvin, Charles Greenlee, Sam Shepard, and Ernest Thomas, were falsely accused of the rape of a white married woman who was named Norma Lee Pageant, and this was in Groveland, Florida. Marshall appealed the guilty verdict of 2 of the men all the way to the Supreme Court, where the convictions were actually overturned in 1951. And then you have this tragic American story for the end of this story, which is that the sheriff, who you learn quite a bit about, Sheriff McCall in the book, sort of has the last word at this moment and ends up shooting one of these men dead, Shepard. And so it's just a riveting story of racial injustice, of bigotry, and of this violent activity that's part of American history that we often don't want to look at. So I think it's safe to say, and don't be offended, but neither of these books are for the faint of heart. I mean, these are really important books, very powerful, but very real and very challenging to read in terms of just the violence and the injustice that's involved in them. But don't let that discourage you, because I actually found this quote from Book Forum, and I thought this said it perfectly. It's about Maaza's book. Nobody can want to hear, that Maaza tells stories that nobody can want to hear in such a way that we cannot stop listening. And I thought that was really perfect. That really kind of captures both of these books. The New York Times called Gilbert's book a must-read, cannot put down history. So they're really page-turners, even though the content is quite extreme. All right, so my first question for both of you is just to hear a little bit about the impetus for your work and sort of how you came upon these topics and how you came upon these settings for, I mean, we're looking at both fiction and nonfiction, but how you came up with this topic and decided to spend this time on this topic for this book.
Well, my book is fiction, but I was born in alive when the revolution started in Ethiopia. So even though I was really young, I had very vivid memories of the outbreak of violence. The only thing is, as a child, people don't really tell you what's going on outside of the house or outside of our compound. So when I would hear gunshots or I would see the soldiers or I would see those things, no one wanted to tell me exactly what was happening. Once I came here to the States as a result of the revolution, I tried, to research and read as much as I could about Ethiopia, but what I was finding was that there wasn't a lot out there. America didn't really know what was happening while it was happening. I started reading stories of the revolution in China, of what happened in Russia, of what was going on in Cuba, the dirty wars in Argentina, and what was happening under Gaddafi in Libya. And that was kind of a roundabout way that I was finding out what was happening in my own country. That was the motivation in many ways, because they always say as writers, you write the book you wish you could have read. And that was my motivation for doing this.
And mine is a little bit different. I did not grow up in the South. I grew up in upstate New York in a very suburban neighborhood. And, one of the things I often talk about is race was not really something that was on my radar. I grew up in a very white-dominated suburban area. And I think that I sort of bought into the way race is taught in a lot of American schools, which is Abraham Lincoln came along and freed the slaves. Then there was like about 100 years, and then Martin Luther King came and did these great things in the 60s, and now we're a better nation. And there's 100 years in there where it was a pretty horrifying place to be if you were African American, which is down in the South. These Jim Crow strictures, these laws, it wasn't just impolite, separate water fountains, separate entrances. I think that was the sort of the iconic images that we sort of taught, wow, that's really rude to African Americans. That's really impolite. And so, as I was researching this, it was much more. It was state-sanctioned white supremacy that was in place for decades. And that was shocking to me because it wasn't the country that I sort of felt I grew up in and the country that was being taught to me. A lot of these areas are skimmed over. And so when I went to do this kind of research back in the 40s and 50s, I would see these kind of laws that were on the books. One of them, for example, is worker fight. I thought this was something from Reconstruction or maybe World War I at the latest. This went up until 1950, and it gave the power to sheriffs in the South to go around well after World War II. And if you weren't in a military uniform or you weren't working that day, and this includes Sundays, they could pick you up, throw you in jail, and keep you there, and then call up the local citrus groves or whatever, cotton or whatever industry there was, and say, I got 10 bodies for you. And by law, the sheriff got to keep those fines. So basically, this was a form of debt slavery or peonage that I don't think a lot of people were aware of. I certainly wasn't aware of it. And so that was sort of an impetus for me to just sort of explore these areas.
Thank you. I meant to mention to all of you here that we're going to have plenty of time tonight for questions from the audience as well. So I just thought I would start us off with a few questions about the books. So I was struck by just how important narrative is in each of these books, and I've been thinking a lot myself about scholarship and narrative and how history plays a part and how important argument is in history and how important narrative is. And I guess my question is really about how you use history in fiction writing and how you write history with a literary bent. And if each of you could just speak a little bit about narrative and how you work with narrative as you were putting together these works, I think that would be enlightening.
Go ahead again.
I think I really struggled with how to transform the research and the memories I had and the hard data that I had collected, how to translate that into fiction. And in fact, I really did not think for a long time that fiction was the best way to tell this story. It felt so close to me, and it felt like fiction wasn't going to do it justice, that so many people had died, and this was such a national tragedy that to incorporate some of these the fictional techniques, poetic language, creating characters, basically telling a kind of artful lie about something that was very true, felt like a betrayal of what I knew happened in that history. I was really lucky, though, in my first year at NYU, my teacher was a South African poet by the name of Brayton Braytonbach, and Brayton had been put in jail for his anti-apartheid work in South Africa, had been put on death row for 5 years, and he was the teacher that I got in school. And when I talked to him that first semester, I said, I don't think that I should be doing this book, and I don't think I should be doing it as fiction. And he said to me, sometimes fiction tells a truth that history cannot. And so you have a tool and you have to use it to tell this story. And that was really, it was the impetus that I needed, but it was something that I had to keep telling myself again and again, how moments when I seemed to run up against fact in many ways, because I knew that I wanted to stick as close as possible to what actually happened, but there are moments when my characters weren't cooperating, or for me to write all 5 years, I couldn't write. The revolution began in 1974 and the dictator left in 1991. There's just no way for me to get into the type of detail that I needed and to encompass all of that. So I ended up compressing things, taking things out, creating different characters, and it was a big struggle, because I had to figure out several times whether my allegiance was to history or whether it was to storytelling, and it had to be storytelling, or the book wouldn't have been done.
Is it okay to follow up? Because I had a question. Because I thought, and I didn't know anything about the Ethiopian Revolution and Haile Selassie. I didn't really know much at all. And so I was looking forward to just learning about that as well as getting the story. And I thought the way you introduced history was a very organic way. It was part of the storytelling, and it didn't feel like a translation or all of a sudden an exposition jump, and now here's 8 pages on the history of Ethiopia.
Right.
And so I'm just curious how you went about self-editing in that, because obviously you know a lot, but the reader doesn't. And how do you make those choices?
Well,
that's a really hard question.
Yeah. Well, what I have to let me turn the question back to you too, because there's a moment. It's really a beautiful moment, and it's right towards the front of it's the beginning of the book when you have this, when Thurgood Marshall is in the train. I think he's in this train, and he's going and he's looking outside, and it's similar. For me, it was wonderful, because this is a historical character. This is someone that, we can look him up on YouTube and find these things, but you've managed to recreate him in terms of sounds and these details that are very visceral, and I don't think you can do that just by watching a video of somebody. So and I struggled with Haile Selassie, who was a historical figure that in my life, with my family anyway, was very much he was a legend as well as a man. He symbolized Ethiopia. He symbolized free Africa for most of the world. And yet I had to figure out a way to break him, in a sense, so that he could fit into this book. And I want you to answer your question with Thurgood Marshall. But for me to be able to take some of these facts, facts in history need to be attached. Facts in books have to be attached to a human being. I mean, if it's not connected, if you don't have the character as a conduit, it's just kind of lays there as a fact. And I did have to edit out a lot of things, because if one of my characters couldn't say it at a dinner table without it sounding natural, it doesn't work in those scenes.
Well, I admit, I had listened to your book on audio. So you have this beautiful British accent who's also delivering these great historical moments. I forget.
Steve Crossley. It
great.
sounds like Game of Thrones. It just kind of
A little bit, but you do get that Ethiopian history, and you get some pretty violent stuff, just like Game of Thrones.
But Maaza's point is a good one. I mean, there is a certain amount of fiction.
Yeah.
You know, this is a true story, obviously.
Right.
But when you're describing Thurgood Marshall on the train, it's a great example. You have to embellish. You have to talk about his character, what he
Right.
sounded like, how he behaved. I mean,
Yeah.
that
Exactly.
we don't have actual records for, probably.
Right, and that's also one of the things. This is nonfiction narrative, so it's not so much a biography. So I am given a little more leeway to sort of get out there and say, all right, I want to set this first scene on a train. I found that whole Thurgood Marshall on a train by himself going down south to take these really violent cases where the Klan is basically waiting for him, and every night he has to shift different houses because the Klan, the Night Riders, will come out and search for him. And it's a very haunting place. And, in some of his interviews, he talked about being tormented by these lynching photos. Mm-hmm. And he was a very brave guy, but he wasn't stupid. And, he would see these photographs come into the office, and they really haunted him. And he makes a comment in one of his interviews that it wasn't the bullets or the rope or the violence of these lynching. What really bothered him was the images of these young children standing around the bodies, getting their photographs taken at a lynching scene, and they're dressed in their Sunday best, and they're smiling and grinning as if they're getting their, portrait taken at a picnic, and that really haunted Marshall. And he talks about waking up in his sleep and just, being nervous that he was going to wind up in a gutter and with all the children from Sunday school posing around his body, and so that's a very visceral and real thing, and it's not something you might see in a biography. But if you're setting a scene and you have this train heading down south and it reaches the Mason-Dixon line, he's got to step over into the the colored car, and then he goes past these whitewashed tin, and he's moving closer and closer, and the trees are starting to change, and he recognizes he's moving into a real dangerous area. Those are the kind of things that, even though it's part of history, it is sort of narrative liberties that you can take. We know he took trains. We know trains had whistles. Right. And those are things that, you can sort of embellish.
That's a really good point. And I guess I would say, I did wonder as I read both of these books just about your historical sources. I mean, obviously you had access to the LDF sources
Right.
and FBI records as well.
Right.
And were those records that had been redacted or not been seen before, or how were you able to get access to those?
What's really interesting in this particular case is I filed a Freedom of Information Act several years ago, and I would call up every month to find out where I was, because when you're requesting a lot of documents, you go on a long list, and so they would say you're number 63 on the long list. And I would call up every month, and they'd say, you're number 62, you're number 60. And I was like, I have a deadline. I'm never going to get this out. And I remember after about a year of this, they knew my name. And I remember one particular call was like, Mr. King, today's your lucky day. And I was like, what, I'm number 48? And they said, no, after 60 years to the day that the case opens, it all becomes public domain. So that day I was able to go, literally the next day I was on a train, and I got dumped files that I could see nothing was redacted. And the great thing about these files, I don't know if you've ever seen FBI files before, but if you've seen ones on television, sometimes they have big black marks, the Chris Christie, for example, like this, everything's redacted, you don't know who's talking. But after 60 years, everything's released. And so what's great about these files was, there's in a part of the book, the Groveland Boys are taken down into a basement and tortured. And they're beaten senseless, the teeth are knocked out. It was horrible beatings until they confessed. And of course the police denied it, sheriff denied it. And so the FBI investigated a civil rights crime, and they went down, the FBI, and FBI are basically good old boy agents. And they go down south, and they're working with these police all the time. And the police have a prepared statement from the prosecutor that says, yes, we arrested the Groveland Boys. We took them into custody. We did notice welts and bruises. Perhaps they got in a fight right before I picked them up. And that was their statement to the FBI. And you'd see that statement on the file. But right after that, it says, off the record, the deputy told me that it was him, and he names the farmer that went down to the basement and beat these guys senseless. For some reason, these guys were under the impression that they could talk to the FBI off the record, and this would never be known. And so all the names are there, and they all sort of check out. They're wealthy people in town, they're farmers. And, the ironic part is the FBI did cover this stuff up. they didn't release this for years. So all the truth is sort of buried in the records.
And Maaza, what about for you? What kind of sources did you use for this book?
Well, a lot of it, at least the first couple of drafts, I went off of memory, just things that I knew or things that I remembered. And then once for fiction, it's a little bit different than nonfiction. Then you get the story down. You get characters in a row, so to speak. And then once I had that and a sense of the direction that the book would take, I started doing some of the research. I ended up reading a lot of political science books. You know, you're looking through historical accounts of this time. I went through some declassified information that was at the State Department that the U.S. was keeping in Library of Congress. All of it had become open for the public. So I was reading up through a lot of that, a lot of interesting things that came up there. And asking people, trying to talk to people who were prisoners during the revolution, or people who were on the other side who were actually the jailers or the interrogators. That was a little bit harder to, people just don't want to talk. Yeah. They don't want to talk. So it takes time to actually ask a roundabout question that you know in 2 or 3 lines will eventually lead to that stuff, and being patient enough to hear not only what's being said, but what's not being said and what's being omitted. And I think that takes time with the book.
Actually, I want to follow up with that. That's a really interesting point, because we have a friend, Adam Johnson, a common friend, who teaches a course at Stanford about trauma narrative. And I noticed you did this in your book, and I noticed it too, not as a literary technique, but just noticing from the transcripts of people who have been tortured. There's a certain way of talking and they focus on really small details. And like I was looking through these transcripts where they're trying to get to the bottom of these beatings. And these young men who were tortured, they say, I remember the room specifically. I remember the pipes, and there was glass on the floor and the clay. And you could hear the lawyers like, get to the part where who beat you. And that's almost been blocked out in a way. They're sort of, they want to make it a real thing, and they want to convince you that they're telling the truth, and they don't even focus on the most painful parts of their interrogation or the torture. They focus on these little details. It's amazing to see that every one of these guys who had been beaten in this book, in this story, they all focused on the clothes. They could identify the exact color of the shirt, where the guns were, where the color of the hose. That their perception of the details in that torture room was remarkable.
I mean, exactly. And the thing that I found out, I mean, it's just, if you really, I remember Adam and I, when we talk about this kind of the trauma that people suffer, and it gets to be the conversations they're really disturbing. And if you're not in that work, you can't really talk to very many people about it. It's not normal dinner conversation. But when we were talking about it, I think the one thing that struck me was that the reason that people focus on these types of details, and this is the thing to keep in mind when you are writing about characters undergoing these situations that they're meant to break the body, but they're really after the spirit. And usually people who are interrogators know they figure out, they're good at reading people within a few minutes. And the one thing that was interesting, and I think you're saying that we were talking about people focus on small details, because eventually the body becomes numb. There's only a certain amount of pain that we can take, and then the body, in a way to protect us, you won't feel it as much. And so the brain then, almost through some kind of horrific sense of boredom, is going to start picking out other things, because the person understands what's happening, but they can't necessarily feel all of it. And I think those are the kind of gruesome and disturbing details of life that you have, like you're talking about with the details that you find out for your book. As a fiction writer too, it's about being in that world. But part of it is also the language. The language has to reflect what the characters are feeling, and that, I think you've done that so well in this. If you look through the book, Gil has you change structure here. He has lists. There's photographs.
That might be an accident.
No, no. There are photographs here. It's almost a way that there's so many different ways to talk about what's happened. Sometimes the language and the way that it's written has to change as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I don't know if you find it, but you write about a little girl who's tortured. I've written about kids who go to the electric chair. It's kind of there's no need to beat anyone over the head with anything. You almost have to tone it down, and it's a very difficult thing to do because what you're describing is so horrific that any language is sort of. I found myself getting really simple with that, like Hemingway-esque. Just get it out there as quietly and soft. Don't describe too much.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think your tact is to do a bit more with literary description and more, like you said, more poetic in some ways.
Yeah.
Which often, softens it a little bit in some ways.
Yeah.
But when you're doing your research, I guess I would wonder, what's the delineation in how you work between research and writing? Like, when does the research stop and the writing begin? I know a little bit about Maaza's writing process, having been in Florence with her last summer, where she would stay in her room the entire day, and then I'd have to knock on the door and say, it's time to come out and eat some dinner. But she was in there writing. And so I'm just curious for both of you, how do you work and how do you write? How do you integrate the research into the writing? And what's your actual process for producing writing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even think I have a real set process. Generally, I tend to get obsessed with certain details and focus on things, and then it's not uncommon for me to take 2 weeks off, just stop writing and just doing research again. I don't have this right, and I need to go back down to the South or something like that and sort of look into this a little more. And there's times where you realize you spent 2 weeks all for the benefit of maybe 2 sentences. And you just go, what was the point? I could have looked at a picture and gotten that. But if it just bugs you so much and it's hard to get past it, you just feel like you don't understand it yet. And so my process is not, deadlines are really just great for that. Just think I got to hand this in. Now I really got to plow through it. And
right.
So that's my process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple more questions, and then, like I said, we will open it up to our audience. I noticed that human rights is really a common theme in both of these books, and there's this fascinating moment actually in The Devil in the Grove where the Soviet foreign minister just explodes about the Groveland case. And he basically says, and this is after the case has been turned over and the men are found innocent, and then one of them is shot and killed. And the Soviet foreign minister says, this is what human rights means in the United States. This is the American way of life. And then he says, I think some people should look after their own business before sticking their noses into other people's business. So, I just was struck by this idea of there's this human rights happening, but it's sort of seen differently in different countries, and it's very contextualized. And I just wondered, in writing these 2 books with that sort of central theme, what kind of impact would you like these books to have, around issues of human rights and social justice?
Well, I found that particular part interesting because, that was a time in America where the Soviets were tweaking America about their African-American problem. And you had a lot of communists and intellectuals in the Northeast who were sort of siding with that. And that was a sort of a dance that Thurgood Marshall had to do in this story and in the early 40s and 50s because, J. Edgar Hoover did not like communists, and he could really shut the NAACP down. And a lot of the African-American intellectuals in New York, especially at the time, had communist bent. And so they were really providing the intellectual firepower behind a lot of the NAACP's movements. And yet Marshall had to sort of keep them at a distance. And what I found fascinating is that Thurgood Marshall would always say, to talk to J. Edgar Hoover, he would say, I'm just as committed to anti-communism as you. And he would say all these public statements about how he was really proud of the work that the FBI was. He basically hated Hoover. He didn't like the FBI. He felt the FBI could not solve a single lynching case south of the Mason-Dixon line. They could solve any stolen car case, any interstate commerce case, but when it came to a lynching, they were dumbfounded. And that really bothered Marshall. And so he did this kind of dance with, I think during the HUAC committee and with J. Edgar Hoover. But, behind the scenes, he said this great thing. He said, if you're African American, you're not on one of those lists, you ought to put a bullet in your head. In other words, I respect everything you're doing, even if you might be a leftist. So it was a sort of a dance that he was doing.
And what about for you, Maaza?
Um,
I mean, I know your new project is going to look at a different time period,
yeah.
but in terms of this book.
Race. Well, the one thing, I'll answer that very briefly. I think the all that I wanted to do in this book is just simply tell a story. I had no idea. I had the blessing of naivete when I was doing it, in the sense that I didn't know it would get published. I was writing it as a student. I had no sense. I just wanted to get this story down. And now that it's been published, I think one of the best things that I've heard. I get these really incredible stories from people, other Ethiopians who were living during the days of the revolution, and the stories that they tell me, and a lot of times it's the first time that they've ever voiced these stories, have been, those are powerful moments. But what I've also found out is that the children of those revolutionaries, children who were born here in the U.S., and their parents fled Ethiopia for whatever reason, have contacted me to say for the first time they were able to read my book and then finally figure out the kinds of questions they could ask their parents, or they finally understood something about their parents, or why their dad can't sleep, or why their mom never talks to them about something. So that, as it's a byproduct, I didn't intend that. But the one thing about the racism, since we've had, it seems like 2013, and this year has, it's been really, there have been really awful years in terms of race relations in the U.S. Trayvon Martin, and it's just, I was in India about a month or so ago, and I think as an American going there, I was shocked at the perception of the U.S. and I don't know if you get it everywhere else, but the first questions people would ask me when I was there to talk about this book was, how can you tell us about your experiences with race in America? Can you give us some anecdotes of your encounters with racists? American racism is so much worse now. Could you give us, so there, and I'm a little bit shocked. I don't know how to answer that. But my sense now is that I think people think outside of the U.S., and this might be an interesting conversation, that we are really back at the days of Jim Crow. That's what I was starting to get from that. Not to say that we have a long way to go, but I wonder if you get questions like this, or what is it when maybe it's the division between still about what the North thinks of the South, or what people think of Florida at this point.
Yeah, that's one I get a lot, because I travel down to Florida to talk about this. But this takes place in Florida, and it seems like every time I go down there, a new young African American is shot by a white guy, and so everyone has questions about that for me. And a lot of times I get, well, nothing's changed, and I sort of say, you have to look at this with a little bit of perspective, because it sort of does a disservice to the people who did change things. And one of the things I point to is, with the Trayvon Martin case, you had protest. NAACP came in and protest. There was a big media storm shortly after he was not indicted, and then suddenly you had the chief of police resign, and then you had a special prosecutor come in, and then it became a trial. And I try to compare that to the time where Sheriff Willis McCall is down south. And there was no way any African Americans were going to gather on a street corner and protest anything to do with Sheriff McCall, because they would have been beaten and thrown in jail, including the media. And so things have changed, and a lot of things have changed because of people like Thurgood Marshall, and because of a lot of the laws that were passed, and a lot more. I think the justice system that we live in today is a lot different now. People have we might not get perfect verdicts in jury trials, but we have at least some semblance of people taking that seriously. Whereas back in the 40s and 50s, the juries that were assembled in the Jim Crow South, they were basically prosecutors' tool. They did whatever the prosecutor told them. And so evidence didn't even matter back then. And that's, I think, one of the things that in my book, people point to, like, they don't even recognize the system of justice. It doesn't seem like something they see on, CSI or when they watch court TV. Like, wait, you can't hide evidence from the defense. You have to turn that over. Really? If the judge says you don't have to, you don't have to.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the reality of the South. And, just echoing something Maaza just mentioned about, as a child, no one ever told you this kind of stuff. I find that a lot down South. I talk to people who are in their 70s and 80s, and they grew up during this time period, and they had no idea this was happening. I get letters all the time from people saying, man, my father was the deputy in this case, and I had no idea. We just thought those prisoners tried to escape. We never heard that other side of the story. And that was sort of a way of, I think, parents protecting children from some of the horrors that they didn't want to acknowledge themselves back then. And so they just, and a lot of them make a point of saying, I kind of grew up in a race-free environment. Well, that's not necessarily, I don't totally believe that. But I definitely think it was better than the generation before them. And it's definitely different today. So when you go overseas, you get those exaggerated accounts.
Yeah.
Like, that's sort of a media fabrication of what's happening in America. It's definitely different. We have an African-American president. That didn't end the whole story, but we live in a very different America from Jim Crow.
I think we can talk more about that with the group. And I guess I was really struck by, just thinking about how different countries perceive and think about race. I actually, I know Maaza's new book is going to be about 1935, so the actual Italian occupation and invasion of Ethiopia, so kind of the prequel to this book. And that made me think a little bit about just how that would tie into the civil rights and what's going on in the US. And there was a lot of support, actually, of African Americans, of Ethiopians, obviously, when the Italians invaded. So I went through and I actually found an article from the Amsterdam News that talks about, and this is a quote, American Negroes aiding the Ethiopian cause, and how there was such a sort of swelling of support from that community when the Italians invaded, but that they felt that Ethiopians weren't as supportive of them. And the quote is, instead, the Ethiopians pronounced most firmly that they were not Negroes and had little interest in the Negro problem, and let it be known that they regarded themselves as Semite in thought, in idea, and by descent. So I was surprised by that, and I thought maybe since this is the same time period, you could talk a little bit about what the significance of that is.
Yeah, there was especially African Americans in Harlem and in Brooklyn in '35. There was a groundswell of support for Ethiopia and the fight against Italian colonialism. But there was also an undercurrent of tension that came from this sense that Ethiopians did not think of themselves as, I think, as Negro here, and it's historically an ongoing point of tension. And one of the things during '35, Haile Selassie had to give an interview, and I think released a public statement saying that his understanding of the word Negro, which was what was used here in the U.S., was something that white Americans were using to call black Americans, and it was a term that came from slavery. And he said, we are not Negro, we are black. And we are all African Americans or black Americans, Ethiopians, people from Nigeria, we are black. But we are not Negro. Marcus Garvey and Haile Selassie did not get along. And it was partly from some of this tension that it helped feed, it exacerbated this tension because Marcus Garvey felt that Haile Selassie should have gone first to African nations and to the African American community to ask for help, as opposed to the League of Nations and to England and to France, and Ethiopia was in the League of Nations. So it is a point of conflict, what it was. But at the same time, there were African Americans pilots who went to Ethiopia in '35 to help train some Ethiopians, and who I think one of them named the Brown Condor, CONDOR, actually flew, and during the revolution in '74, one of the movements that young Ethiopians looked at was the civil rights movement. In order to, and there was a constant talk, if Americans could change, if black people in America could make a change, that we can too. So it was held up as an example.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, now because we had Oscars this week, of course, some of you may have heard that the Devil in the Grove is going to be made into a film by Lionsgate. We have some applause over here.
Yay.
And I guess I just had to ask, because we all have to ask, how involved are you going to be in the screenplay and the casting and all that? And how important to you is it that the film reflect your work and be historically accurate? Or have you let go of that?
Those are really good questions, and I struggle with them. I don't really know. It turns out today I just got the script, so I finally got to see the story, so it became a little more real to me today. And I just started reading. I haven't even finished yet. But, it's one of those things. I recognize movies are just very different from books. You can't pack everything in. There's going to be already characters are being condensed into one character. And all those little choices are made, and it sort of feels like it's out of your hands. Technically, I'm supposed to be a consultant. I don't know if that's saying, you're ruining my book, I need to fix this myself. I don't know what my power is. I don't even know what the structure is of that. But so far, what I've seen I really like, and I'm definitely just going to try and support it and make suggestions. But it's a hard question to answer because I don't really know what my role actually is. I mean, it's not antagonistic yet. So.
Okay, well, that could be good,
Yeah,
I guess.
But one of the things I think everybody thinks is just reaching a larger audience, and I feel personally responsible. Sort of Thurgood Marshall's legacy. I think he's sort of a forgotten contributor to the civil rights movement. So I think it's really important that people learn. Thurgood Marshall doesn't have a monument. And some people say, well, the monument to America is the system that we live in today, the justice system, and some of the freedoms we have. We had some very big landmark cases, voting rights, housing, school cases. That's sort of his legacy that we live
Brown
in.
versus Board of Education. I mean,
Right.
that's what everyone seems to know him for.
Right.
And this case really was not part of that historical record.
Right.
I mean, you really kind of unearthed that in this book.
Yeah, and a lot of people didn't realize when you read this book, you find out that the entire Brown versus Board case was funded on the back of this criminal case because it was much more easy to get publicity when you put two bodies on the cover of a newspaper as opposed to some kind of housing dispute or a plea to raise money for voting rights. It just wasn't that dynamic an issue. But when you had people dying at the hands of racist sheriffs, and then you read the testimony of these poor young kids, that really raised money, and they raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it lasted throughout Brown.